I want to tell you something that no teacher of success will put at the center of his teaching. Not because it is untrue, because it is too uncomfortable to say plainly, and a comfortable teaching draws a larger crowd than an honest one. Here's the thing. Before the great wealth comes, before the fortune, before the achievement, before the life that a man has been working toward with every hour he could spare, three things happen. Three specific things in a recognizable order that have appeared in the life of every man whose record of success I have examined across 50 years of research. These three things look from the outside and often from the inside exactly like the end of the road. They arrive wearing the costume of permanent defeat. They speak in the voice of finality. They produce in a man the precise feeling that his effort has been wasted, that his purpose was mistaken, and that the intelligent course of action is to accept the situation and stop. This is the deception. This is what I mean when I say that failure is a trickster with a keen sense of irony and cunning. It appears at the gate of every great fortune, dressed in the costume of permanence, holding a sign that says, "This is the end." The man who reads that sign and believes it never learns that the gate was already open, that 3 feet behind him, the ore was richer than anything he had yet found. What I'm about to give you is not inspiration. It is not encouragement. It is a map drawn from the verified histories of men who actually built fortunes of the 3 specific events that precede great wealth. If you can identify where you are on that map, you will respond differently than the man who cannot. And that difference in response is in the final accounting the only difference that matters. Part 1. Why great wealth requires a trial. Have spent the better part of 50 years studying the lives of men who failed and the lives of men who succeeded. I have analyzed more than 25,000 who were classified as failures and more than 500 who were classified as successes. And I will tell you the single most consistent difference I found between these two groups. It was not intelligence. Many of the failures were cleverer men than many of the successes. It was not education. I have seen men of great university learning go to their graves having never built a thing of lasting consequence. And I have seen men who could barely write their own names build fortunes that outlasted them by generations. It was not circumstance of birth, nor favorable opportunity, nor the lack of connections. The single most consistent difference was this: the manner in which a man responded to temporary defeat. The man who succeeded treated defeat as information, as a message from circumstances written in a language he was determined to learn, telling him that something in his plan was wrong and needed to be corrected. He received it, studied it, corrected his plan, and continued. The man who failed treated defeat as a verdict, as evidence that the thing he sought was not available to him, that the world had spoken its final word on the matter, and that the decent thing to do was to accept it. These two men could receive the identical defeat in the identical circumstance at the identical moment in their respective lives, and one would use it as a stepping stone, and the other would use it as a resting place. And from that single difference in interpretation, their lives would diverge so completely that 10 years later, you would not believe they had ever stood in the same room. Now, before I name the 3 things that happened before great wealth, I must explain to you why the fist of vice pattern exists at all. Who understands why the trial comes will endure it differently than the man who merely knows that it comes. Here's what I have come to believe after a lifetime of careful examination. When the force I call infinite intelligence, or divine intelligence, as some have named it, wants a great man to do a great work in the world, it does not deliver that man to the work untested. It does not place great responsibility in the hands of a man whose character has not been proven under the weight of adversity. No capable executive in any enterprise would select his most trusted lieutenants from among those he had never observed under pressure. He tests them. He places difficulty before them, watches how they respond, and draws his conclusions from their conduct, not from their declarations. Nature operates by the same principle on a grander scale, with greater precision and without sentiment. I am reminded of a poem written by a woman who understood this principle more deeply. I am reminded of a poem written by a woman who understood this principle more deeply than most men of her age. She described what nature does when she intends to make something great of a man. She does not protect him. She hammers him. She hurts him. She converts him by mighty blows into shapes of trial. She makes him lonely so that only the highest messages will reach him. She disappoints him repeatedly, who she has sacredly chosen. She bends him, but she does not break. And in the end, when the crisis comes, when the shout goes up that must call the leader out there, he stands prepared, purified, ready for the work he was always intended to do. Failure in this light is not punishment. It is preparation. It is nature's furnace, the place where the dross is burned away from the metal. And what remains is the thing that can withstand the test of hard use. I am convinced of this, not as a matter of faith, but as a matter of documented observation. The success of every man I have examined closely has been almost exact ratio to the extent of the obstacles and difficulties he had to surmount. Those who faced the greatest trials and held on through them built the largest fortunes and rendered the greatest service. Those who were spared the trials or who retreated from them built nothing proportionate to their native capacity. Now, the three things they do not always arrive in precisely the same order. They do not always look identical from one man's life to the next, but they are recognizable to the man who has been taught to recognize them. And the recognition is the single most valuable preparation a man can have for the journey ahead. The first thing is the stripping, the loss of what a man thought he had built his resources, his position, his certainty about the direction of his life. The second thing is the silence, the period when nothing appears to be happening, when the effort expended seems to have produced nothing. When the voices of doubt are loudest, precisely because there is no visible evidence to contradict them. The third thing is the final test. The arrival of the moment that looks by every available measure like the permanent end, the moment of humiliation, the moment when a man who has persisted through everything else is brought at last to his knees. These three things are not misfortunes. They are the gate. And the man who understands this is the man who walks through it. But two, the first thing, everything is stripped away. Let me tell you about a man. He had spent 20 years building toward a goal. He had accumulated knowledge and experience and reputation. He had written and lectured and organized and planned. He had studied the methods of the greatest achievers his era had produced, had sat in their presence, had heard their principles from their own lips, had spent year after year gathering the evidence that would, when complete, constitute the most useful philosophy of personal achievement ever assembled. By his own accounting, in the year when the stripping came, he was within sight, constitute the most useful philosophy of personal achievement ever assembled. By his own accounting, in the year when the stripping came, he was within sight of the end. The work was nearly done. The years of labor were about to yield their harvest. Then in the space of a few months it was gone, not partially entirely. The enterprise he had built collapsed, the income stopped. The plan he had trusted proved unsound. He found himself at the end of 923 in Columbus, Ohio, without funds, without a plan, without a single idea for how to work his way out of the difficulty. He was stranded, helpless. And this is what made his condition particularly unbearable. He had spent 20 years lecturing men and women on the principles of success. He had studied 25,000 failures and presumed to teach others what caused them. He had positioned himself as a guide. And now he stood in the full private knowledge that no one else could see, more helpless than any of the 25,000 he had judged. Guide. And now he stood in the full private knowledge that no one else could see, more helpless than any of the 25,000 he had judged. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw contempt. He had become, in his own estimation, a charlatan, a man who offered others a remedy for failure which he could not apply to himself. That man was myself. I'm not telling you this story as a confession of weakness. I'm telling it as a description of what the stripping looks like from the inside, so that when it arrives in your own life, you will recognize it and you will understand what it is. Because what I did not know in the depths of that difficulty was that the stripping was Because what I did not know in the depths of that difficulty was that the stripping was not destruction. It was excavation. It was the removal of the layers of false certainty and comfortable illusion that had been sitting above the only foundation that would actually hold the foundation of a fully completed and genuinely tested philosophy, born not from theoretical study, but from the furnace of personal failure. Every one of the 7 major turning points of my life, each one of which appeared in the moment to be defeat, was in retrospect a redirection. The loss of a position I had valued forced me into a field I had not considered. The bankruptcy of an enterprise I had trusted opened a door that the enterprise itself had been blocking. The second military draft that emptied my school of students and wiped out $75,000 of income in a single stroke sent me in a direction that the school would never have allowed me to reach if it had continued to prosper. Each stripping removed something that was in the way of the thing I was actually meant to build. Now let me show you the same pattern in another man's life. Something that was in the way of the thing I was actually meant to build. Now let me show you the same pattern in another man's life. There was a young minister in the stockyards district of a great city. He had a vision, and it was a large one. He wished to build an institution where young men and women would learn to think in practical rather than theoretical terms, where education would be rooted in the reality of life rather than removed from it. He had carried this vision for nearly 2 years. He had carried this vision for nearly 2 years. He had thought about it until it had become, in his own words, a consuming obsession. But nothing happened. He spoke of it to no one with the power to help him. He made no concrete move toward its realization. He had the vision without the plan, the desire without the action, and for 2 years the stripping took a different form. The stripping of his certainty that the thing was possible, the slow erosion of conviction by the evidence that nothing was moving. Then on a Saturday afternoon, sitting in a small room with no comfortable alternative available to him, he did the one thing that the previous 2 years had not produced. He made a decision, not vague specific. He would have his $1 million within 1 week. He did not know how. He committed to the date before he had a plan for meeting it. Within 36 hours, a man named Philip Armour walked to the pulpit where the minister had just delivered the sermon of his life and offered the $1 million. The minister's name was Dr. Frank Gonzalez. The minister's name was Dr. Frank Gonzalez. The institution built with that money still stands. What was stripped away from Gonzalez in those 2 years was the luxury of indefinite hoping. The stripping forced him to the decision, and the decision once made produced results that 2 years of earnest but vague desire had been completely unable to produce. This is what the stripping always does when a man is paying attention. It removes what is in the way. It removes the comfortable position that makes the decisive action feel unnecessary. It removes the illusion that things of action feel unnecessary. It removes the illusion that things will improve on their own if a man simply continues with what he has been doing. When everything has been stripped, only 2 things remain: the man and the question of what he will do next. The man who answers that question with the full force of a definite decision today, not when conditions improve, has passed the first test. Here is what the stripping demands of you. Do not try to rebuild what was taken. Look beneath what was taken and find the thing that cannot be taken. The knowledge accumulated, the principle mastered, the understanding earned through the years of effort that preceded the loss. That is the foundation. The thing that was stripped was not the foundation. It was sitting above the foundation, and it had to be removed before the foundation could be seen. Part 3. The second thing, the silence when nothing appears to happen. Now let me tell you about a different kind of trial. A man had built one of the most successful enterprises in the industrial history of his country. He was not satisfied. He saw with the eye of an imagination that had never been content with what already existed. Successful enterprises in the industrial history of his country. He was not satisfied. He saw with the eye of an imagination that had never been content with what already existed, that a new and more powerful thing was possible, a thing that the best technical minds of his era, men of genuine learning and proven competence, declared to be impossible. He gave the instruction anyway. The engineers worked. 6 months passed. At the end of those 6 months, they reported the thing cannot be done. He said, go ahead. Another 6 months passed. At the end of a full year, the same cannot be done. He said, go ahead. Another 6 months passed. At the end of a full year, the same report. Nothing has worked. Every conceivable approach has been tried. The thing remains impossible. He said, I want it, and I'll have it. Go right ahead. And then, as if by a stroke of magic that had nothing magical about it at all, the secret was discovered. The man was Henry Ford. The thing he demanded was an engine with eight cylinders cast in a single block, a thing that every expert said could not be built. It was built. I want you to understand what happened during that year of silence. During that year, nothing visible was occurring. No progress report was favorable. No evidence supported the belief that the instruction would ever be fulfilled. By every conventional measure, by every standard the world uses to judge whether a project is succeeding or failing, that year was a year of failure, but the instruction had been given. The subconscious machinery of a group of trained minds had been set in motion. And the subconscious mind, as I have taught for many years, never stops working. Subconscious mind, as I have taught for many years, never stops working. It works continuously while a man is awake and while he sleeps. It works in the silence. It works in the absence of visible result. It works precisely when the conscious mind has declared the problem impossible and is looking for the exit. Ford knew this. He had not the slightest intention of retreating from his instruction simply because the engineers could not yet execute it. He had given the order. The order was being processed in the invisible machinery of concentrated minds at a depth and with a persistence that the absence of visible result could not measure. He waited. The absence of visible result could not measure. He waited. He held his position, and the answer came. Now let me take you back to the gold mine. A man had staked a claim in Colorado. He had found a rich vein of ore, had built the machinery to extract it, had watched the first shipment prove the richness of the find. Then the vein disappeared. He drilled on. He tried every direction. He found nothing. During the silence, during the weeks when the drills found only rock and the returns produced nothing, what was happening? 3 feet away, the richest vein was waiting. The silence was not the absence of gold. The gold was as present during the silence as it had been before the silence began. The silence was the test of whether the man would hold his position long enough for the 3 feet to be crossed. He did not hold. He sold the equipment and went home. The man who bought the equipment, a man who knew enough to ask an expert before quitting, crossed those 3 feet. He took millions of dollars from the same mine. There's only one question of the man who endures it. Will you hold your position? Not your comfort, your position, your aim, your daily practice of feeding the subconscious mind the instruction it has been given through the method of autosuggestion with the full weight of emotional conviction behind it. Not because the evidence supports your faith, but because faith is precisely the state of mind that continues to act in the absence of visible evidence. I want to describe what the silence sounds like from the inside. Because men who have not been warned often misinterpret it. It sounds like doubt. It sounds like the patient, reasonable voice that says, you have tried long enough. You have given this your best effort. There is no shame in acknowledging that the result is not coming. The prudent man adjusts his expectations to the available evidence. This voice is the voice of the drifter. It is the voice that, in my investigation, has spoken at the bedside of more potential than all the thieves and swindlers in history, because a thief who takes a man's money takes only money. This voice, if believed, takes the fortune that was 3 feet away. The correct response to the silence is not increased agitation, not frantic changes of method, not the anxious redoubling of effort that comes from doubt rather than faith. The correct response is the continued daily emotionally charged practice of holding the dominant thought. The continued reading of the statement of definite purpose, the continued expectation, not desperate but absolute, that the subconscious mind, which has received its instruction and never stops working, will produce the result at the moment it is ready. The farmer does not dig up his seed in December to see if it has germinated. He plants in the knowledge of the law, and he waits in the confidence of the man who understands what the law will do. The silence between the planting and the harvest is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of a natural I cannot see. Hold your position in the silence. The subconscious mind is working. 3 feet away. The vein has never moved. Part 4. The third thing. The moment that looks like the end. I have described the stripping and the silence. Now I must describe the third thing. The one I want to lay before you with the greatest care because it is the one that claims the most men. It arrives after everything else. It arrives when a man has already demonstrated the kind of courage and persistence that most men never find. And it is, in my experience, the most severe of the 3 trials precisely because of this timing. The third thing is the final test. It arrives wearing the specific appearance of total and permanent defeat, not partial defeat, not temporary, the complete and apparently irreversible failure of entire enterprise, the humiliation, the failure, the private knowledge that the years of effort produced not merely a poor result, but a negative one that a man has arrived after all his labor than where he started. The forces of defeat are not random in their timing. I've observed this too many times to attribute it to chance. The final test is always most severe at the moment when the man is closest to the other side. This is not cruelty. It is the nature of the test itself, because the test is not measuring how a man responds to early difficulty. It is measuring something much more specific. How a man responds when he has already given everything he has and defeat arrives anyway. The man who quits at that point does so not because he lacked intelligence or talent or initial determination. He quits because he does not know that the severity of the test is evidence of the proximity of the gate. He reads the sign, "This is the end," and believes it and turns back. And 3 feet behind him, as always, was the vein. Let me tell you about a night. The man had spent more than 20 years in the service of a mission he had received from one of the greatest men of his era. He had built enterprises and lost them. He had published and lectured and organized and failed. He had the specific condition I described in the second part of this teaching. Stranded, without funds, without a plan, more helpless than any man he had ever judged. Then came something worse. A close friend, a newspaper editor who had believed in his work and provided him with a platform, was murdered. The man who killed that friend believed, rightly or wrongly, that the man I am describing was connected with the expose that had provoked the murder. His life was threatened. He went into hiding in the mountains of West Virginia, staying with relatives, rarely leaving the house after dark, still in his coat pocket when he did. During the months that followed, something happened to him that he had experienced through any of his previous difficulties. His courage left him, not gradually, completely. His initiative was destroyed. His ambition, the force that had driven him through 20 years of hardship and temporary defeat, departed. He became, by his own description, indifferent, not only toward himself, but toward those around him, grouchy and irritable, and increasingly still. He was alive. He could move, but he could not think of a single move by which to continue toward the goal he had set himself at Carnegie's suggestion more than 2 years before. Every time he looked in a mirror, he spoke to the man he saw in terms that are not printable. He believed himself to be a fraud. He had lectured the world on 17 principles of success and could not apply a single one to his own condition. His reasoning faculty had been almost paralyzed. That was the final test. And then one evening in the fall of 1907, more than a year after the worst of those, he left the house and walked to the public school building on a hill of the town. He began to walk around the building. He must have made several hundred circles before anything resembling organized thought began to form. He kept saying to himself, "There is a way out, and I'm going to find it before I go back to the house." He meant it absolutely without reservation or qualification. Then, not gradually, not through a slow accumulation of small encouragements, like a flash of lightning out of a clear sky. An idea broke into his mind with such force that it drove the blood through his veins. The thought was precise. It was a command. And the command was this. This is your testing time. You have been reduced to poverty and humiliated in order to be for your other self. He walked home. He sat at his typewriter. His children were looking through the window at the neighbor's Christmas tree because none at their house that year. He placed the first sheet of paper in the machine and began to write. He did not stop until the work was done. That man was myself. The work that began on that Christmas Eve after the most devastating year of my life became the body of knowledge from which millions of people drew the courage to rebuild their own lives. The most severe defeat I ever faced was the final door through which the life's work I had been preparing for 20 years finally entered the world. Now, let me give you the rule drawn not from my own experience alone, but from the histories of more than 500 men of verified success. More than 500 of the most successful men this country has ever known told me their greatest success came just one step beyond the point at which defeat had overtaken them. One step, not a year's further effort, one step. Failure is a trickster. For a long distance, wearing him down, and then in the precise moment when he is most nearly finished, to appear in its most convincing disguise and say, "This is permanent." Columbus died in chains, a prisoner, disgraced. He never knew that what the world called his failure was the discovery of a continent, and that the greatest nation on earth would be built on the ground he had found. Lincoln died without knowing that what his enemies had for decades called his failure had given sound foundation to the nation he had fought to preserve. Woodrow Wilson died a broken man, believing himself to have failed. Time, the great miracle worker that rights all wrongs, will place his name at the very top of the page of the truly great. These men were not failed by their work. They were finished by the world's verdict. A verdict that their own deaths prevented them from hearing overturned. There can be no failure for the man who still fights on. A man has never truly failed until he accepts temporary defeat as permanent. Until that moment, until the man himself renders that verdict, the verdict is not final. And the man who withholds it, who refuses to brand himself a failure, regardless of what the world says, has preserved the one thing that makes the final step possible. Here's how to recognize the final test. It arrives at step possible. Here's how to recognize the final test. It arrives after a sustained period of effort, not at the beginning, but deep into the journey. It carries the specific quality of humiliation, not merely difficulty, but the sense that the entire enterprise has been exposed as foolish. It produces a stillness and a silence different from the silence of the second test. Not the patient silence of a man who is waiting for the invisible work to complete, but the heavy silence of a man who does not know what to do next and is not sure he has the strength to find out. When you find yourself in that specific combination of circumstances, you are almost certainly at the threshold. Do not make any permanent decision during the final test. Write this instruction on a piece of paper and keep it where you can see it. The man who quits permanently during a temporary condition makes a permanent mistake. He closes a door that, had he remained for one more hour, would have opened on its own. Walk, think, return to the statement of your definite purpose. Read it aloud with every particle of feeling you can raise and repent of your definite purpose. Read it aloud with every particle of feeling you can raise and repeat it until its sound is larger in your mind than the voice of the despair. The breakthrough, when it comes from this point, does not come gradually. It comes as mine came like lightning. Part 5. After the three things, the wealth that follows, I want now to describe what happens to the man who passes all three tests, not as a guarantee, as a description of a documented, repeatable, historically verified outcome for the man who understands the pattern and holds firm within it. There is a truth I encountered in the writings of a man who was in his time one of the wealthiest philosophers in the world. He was an advisor to a great king. And when the king asked him what lesson he wished his ruler to take to heart above all others, he said, "I am reminded, O king, that there is a wheel on which the affairs of men revolve, and its mechanism is such that it prevents any man from being always fortunate. This is not a counsel of despair, it is the most encouraging truth a man in difficulty can receive. The wheel is always turning. If it brings sorrow today, it will bring joy tomorrow in mass, provided the man does not step off the wheel in the dark moment. Provided he holds his position while the hard side of the wheel is pressing against him, knowing that the wheel has not stopped, that the turning is continuous, and that the side he needs is coming. The man who steps off the wheel in the dark moment, who quits during the stripping, or retreats during the silence, or accepts the final test's verdict as permanent, will never know how close he was to the side of the wheel that would have lifted him. He will carry that not knowing for the rest of his life. The man who holds on knows something different. He knows it not as philosophy, but as experience. The experience of having been on the hard side, of having held his position, and of having felt the wheel turn. Let me show you what happens after the 3 tests in the life of the man whose story I know best. A young man went to Colorado with his uncle to find gold. They found it richly, abundantly. Then the vein disappeared, and weeks of drilling found nothing. They sold the equipment and went home defeated. The uncle took nothing of permanent value from the experience. The young man took one of the most valuable lessons in the history of achievement summarized in a few words. I stopped 3 feet from gold. I will never stop again because someone said in a few words. I stopped 3 feet from gold. I will never stop again because someone says no. That lesson applied without retreat to the business of selling life insurance made R.U. Darby one of fewer than 50 men in the country who sold more than $1 million in insurance every year. The defeat that ended his uncle's career began Darby's. The same experience received by 2 men produced two entirely different outcomes because one man found the lesson in the defeat and the other man found only the defeat. And now I want to show you the fullest picture, the pattern as it ran across the entire length of one man's working life from first turning point to last. He came to America as a child from poverty in Scotland. He began at the lowest position available to him, a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, earning wages so small that the figure is almost too humble to state. He did not have great formal learning. He did not have influential connections. He had something else, a definite aim, and the habit of surrounding himself with minds that could do what he could not do alone. He lost positions. He was redirected by circumstances into fields he had not intended. He watched enterprises he had built collapse under conditions beyond his control. Each loss stripped away something he had depended upon and left him standing on what remained. The knowledge, the principle, the growing understanding of how organized minds could produce results that no single mind, however powerful, could produce alone. The silence, in his case, single mind, however powerful, could produce alone. The silence, in his case, lasted years. The work of building the greatest industrial enterprise his nation had ever seen was not completed quickly or smoothly. There were years when nothing visible appeared to be happening, when the effort and the patience produced no immediate evidence of the fortune that was accumulating in the invisible machinery of organized human effort. And when the final test came, when the full weight of the competition and the opposition and the accumulated doubt bore down at once, he did not retreat. He did not qualify his aim. He did not revise his expectation downward to match the appearance of the moment. He became the master of the steel industry. He gave away a fortune in the hundreds of millions. He left behind as the legacy that mattered most to him, not the steel, but the philosophy, the understanding that success is governed by laws as precise as any law that governs the physical world, and that those laws are available to every man who has the patience and the courage to apply them. That man was Andrew Carnegie. He began at wages that would have been embarrassing to a common laborer. He arrived where he arrived not because fate was kind and not because the trials were few, but because every trial he encountered was endured long enough to yield its lesson, and every lesson was applied to the building of the next stage of the work. Now, I want to give you the full instruction, the practical, immediate, actionable steps that follow from everything I've placed before you tonight. First, name honestly and without flinching which of the three things you are currently experiencing. The flinching, which of the three things you are currently experiencing. The stripping, the loss of what you thought you had built. The silence. The period when nothing appears to be happening despite your sustained effort. Or the final test, the moment of apparent total and permanent defeat. Name it. Write it down. Because the man who can name what is happening to him is in an entirely different position than the man who simply endures it without understanding. The man who knows he is in the silence will hold his position. The man who does not know it will mistake the silence for evidence of failure. The man who knows he is in the final test will look for the lightning. The man who does not know it will accept the verdict. Second, write a single sentence in language that admits no retreat, declaring that you understand what this period is and that you have decided it will not end your pursuit. Not a hope, a decision made tonight, permanent. Third, read your statement tonight, permanent. Third, read your statement of definite purpose tonight before you sleep and tomorrow morning before you rise, with the full understanding that the subconscious mind is already at work on its fulfillment, that the vein has not moved, that the wheel is still turning, that 3 feet, possibly less, separates you from the thing you have been moving toward. Fourth, do not make any permanent decision during the final test. This instruction is simple. And it is absolute. The man who sleeps on his decision before he quits has given the wheel one more turn. In that one turn, the lightning sometimes comes. There is no failure. There is only the man who accepted temporary defeat as permanent, and he accepted it of his own free will in an act of decision that no external force required of him. The world did not make him quit. He chose to quit. And it is equally true and equally within the power of the same will that chose to quit to choose not to quit. The great wealth does not come to men who were never tested. It comes exclusively to men who were tested and who endured the testing long enough to reach the other side of the gate. Every man of wealth whose history I have examined passed through the 3 things I have described tonight. Not one was spared. The 3 things I have described tonight. Not one was spared. Not one who held firm through all 3 was ultimately denied. The stripping removes the false foundation. The silence proves the faith. The final test reveals the man. You are the man. You are not at the end of the road. The sign says you are. The sign is a trickster. The gate is already open. The only question remaining, and it is the only question that has ever separated the man who arrives from the man who does not, is whether you will walk through it. Walk. Grab the free auto-suggestion sheet in the description. It's based on exactly what we're covering here. Actually apply what you have learned, what we're covering here. Actually apply what you have learned here. Don't just listen. So pause this, get the sheet now, and watch your life finally start moving in the right direction.